In the early months of 2025, a quiet tension gripped a nation already frayed by political division, economic uncertainty, and the lingering shadow of global unrest. In the United States, where belief systems intersect with media consumption and historical memory, prophecy began to occupy a curious and growing space in public discourse, not merely as a relic of religious thought, but as a perceived lens through which some Americans interpreted world events, warnings, and upheavals. Among the voices rising from that space stood one figure whose message captured both widespread attention and growing controversy. His name was Joshua Giles, a Christian leader whose reputation had steadily grown through his teachings on divine revelation, modern-day prophecy, and national destiny. He had long spoken to spiritual audiences about the intersections between scripture and culture, but it was a specific prophecy, one concerning war, that launched his name into national awareness. He claimed that a revelation had come to him over several months. Not a vague impression, but a vivid sequence of visions pointing toward what he described as an imminent global conflict. In his telling, the year 2025 would mark the beginning of a series of armed confrontations that would surpass any modern memory. Unlike past wars, which were framed by conventional strategy and diplomacy, this coming conflict would unfold asymmetrically by digital sabotage, sudden escalation, and the unraveling of international alliances. He spoke of cities cloaked in silence, not by bombs but by the collapse of communication networks. He described invisible warfare, cyber strikes, and satellite-based disruption. And he warned that these developments would precede kinetic military engagement. According to his vision, the United States would not be a distant observer. It would be drawn in directly, politically and militarily, shaken on both domestic and international fronts. Those who heard him responded in varied ways. Among faith-based communities already attuned to the language of prophetic insight, his words resonated with urgency. His message spread through digital pulpits, live streams, podcasts, and email threads, carrying with it both conviction and anxiety. Some interpreted it as a call to spiritual awakening. Others saw it as confirmation of their worst fears about America's trajectory. Outside these circles, reactions were mixed. Critics saw in his statements an opportunistic exploitation of geopolitical anxiety. Others dismissed him outright, grouping his message with a broader trend of fear-based messaging that, in their view, blurred the line between religious expression and social manipulation. But what made the prophecy difficult to ignore was its coherence with the headlines of the day. In the Middle East, long-standing tensions surged between Israeli forces and militant factions in Gaza. In Eastern Europe, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine entered its third calendar year with new offensives and international repercussions. In East Asia, the delicate balance between China and Taiwan continued to tip under military pressure and political posturing, while American forces repositioned quietly in the Pacific. Taken separately, these were recognizable global events. Taken together, they formed a constellation of conflict. And for those who followed Giles's prophecy, they were not merely developments, they were signs. He did not name dates, he did not offer geographic specifics, but the thematic structure of his vision aligned with real-time developments in military spending, diplomatic tensions, and cyber warfare. And in an era where institutions had lost credibility among large portions of the population, a spiritual interpretation of world events appealed to those who felt disillusioned with conventional narratives. Giles positioned himself not as a political analyst, but as a spiritual watchman. He drew from scripture to describe patterns of collapse and renewal. He invoked ancient empires to frame modern conditions: Rome, Babylon, Persia. He described each as a mirror through which modern America could see itself. Each had reached a height of cultural power. Each had, in his view, turned away from divine principle. Each had fallen. In this context, his prophecy was not only a forecast of global war, but a warning about internal erosion. He described America as a nation in moral decline, where distractions masked deterioration. In his framework, War was not merely a geopolitical event, but a spiritual reckoning. It would shake systems, but more importantly, it would expose hearts. This fusion of religious narrative and global forecasting struck a chord. Within weeks of sharing his message publicly, Giles's digital reach expanded rapidly. His videos were reposted, transcribed, discussed. His name appeared in independent media channels, some amplifying his words, others seeking to debunk them. But even among skeptics, the question lingered, what if he was right? He was not the only one speaking of war. Others in the prophetic movement shared similar warnings. Yet it was the precision of his framing, his ability to speak both spiritually and geopolitically, that set his message apart. He spoke of digital tremors in infrastructure, of strategic alliances crumbling like sandcastles, and of a coming event that would be interpreted first as a cyber failure, then as an act of war. He did not frame the war as an end, but as a hinge, an interruption that would create space for transformation or for collapse. He spoke of opportunity in the chaos, of revival following judgment, of clarity forged through disruption. But these words did not soften the intensity of his warning. If anything, they heightened its gravity. As his message spread, a small but notable segment of Americans began to prepare, not in dramatic or militant ways, but in quiet, methodical adjustments. Families began stocking water and fuel. Churches held late-night prayer vigils. Individuals rewrote emergency plans. Some withdrew funds from banks. Others researched land in less populated states. These were not mainstream behaviors, but they were not isolated either. Across the country, in living rooms and basements, people were watching and waiting. The mainstream media made little mention of Giles, but the narrative he sparked was not contained by official silence. In an information age, movements bypass gatekeepers. His prophecy spread through encrypted group chats, private Telegram channels, and long-form video essays. The more it was ignored by major platforms, the more his followers took that as validation. In this climate, the line between spiritual interpretation and political perception grew thin. The prophecy did not endorse any party or policy, but it contributed to a broader sense of foreboding. A sense that something foundational was shifting, and that institutional voices were unable or unwilling to speak to it. What emerged from this was not hysteria, but a low-grade ambient preparedness. People spoke more quietly about supply chains, international sanctions, military drafts. The language of war, once reserved for headlines, became part of domestic conversation. And in these conversations, prophecy served not just as prediction, but as paradigm. It framed how events were understood, how motives were perceived, how hope was managed. For Giles's followers, the prophecy also brought clarity to a world increasingly defined by noise. It provided a narrative thread, a spiritual architecture within which events made sense. It allowed for grief without despair, and for vigilance without paralysis. But prophecy does not exist in a vacuum. Its impact is shaped not only by what is said, but by when it is said, and how it is heard. And in 2025, a year already marked by political instability, market volatility, and international strain, Giles's words landed with force, not because they introduced new fears, but because they named existing ones. They gave form to what many already felt, but could not articulate. And so the prophecy became more than a message. It became a lens, a framework, a whisper beneath the news. Not everyone believed it. Many rejected it entirely. But the fact of its spread, its reach, its resonance, revealed something deeper about the cultural moment in which it arose. It revealed a nation searching for coherence, for meaning, for a sense that someone somewhere understood what was coming. For some, that someone was Joshua Giles. For others, it was no one. But the questions remained. Was the world really on the brink? Was America truly under threat? Was this moment different from all the others? And if the answer to any of those questions was yes, then what came next? That question, what comes next, hung quietly over the first quarter of 2020 in boardrooms and bedrooms, in sermons in schools, in tweets and text threads, and behind it all the prophecy lingered, not yet proven, not yet disproven, but present, in the imagination, in the headlines, and in the uneasy rhythm of a world watching itself. In the months following the initial dissemination of the prophecy, the world continued its slow march towards something many could not name, but few could ignore. On the surface, daily life in the United States retained its predictable cadence. Children went to school, markets opened, political ads cluttered the screens, and social media scrolled forward without pause. Yet beneath this surface lay a growing fracture, a quiet awareness that things were not well, and perhaps had not been for some time. For those who took the prophecy seriously, each new international development was viewed not in isolation, but as a strand in a larger web. Military exercises in the Pacific were no longer just training maneuvers, they were rehearsals for a coming storm. Cybersecurity reports detailing massive data breaches were not mere inconveniences, they were preludes. And trade wars were not economic skirmishes, but ideological battlegrounds. The lens had shifted. Events were no longer random or separate. They were part of a sequence, part of a shaking. Across the Atlantic, the war in Ukraine continued to grind on. What had once been framed as a regional crisis had evolved into a long attritional campaign, with no clear endpoint. Sanctions had hardened economies into camps. Military aid flowed from Western nations like clockwork. And in the gaps between political speeches and battlefield updates, whispers grew louder. Whispers of escalations, of borders redrawn, of alliances tested. In this context, the prophecy gained a new edge. The alignment was not perfect, but it was close enough to stir the minds of those watching. Further east, tensions surrounding Taiwan reached new heights. Chinese military aircraft began crossing the median line of the Taiwan Strait with regularity, an act once considered a provocation, but now described as normalized tension. The United States responded with presence, carrier groups repositioned, diplomatic visits made, trade routes recalibrated. To the untrained observer, it was geopolitical choreography. To those steeped in the prophecy, it was confirmation. Back home, the U.S. faced its own internal reckoning. Economic forecasts teetered. Inflation, thought to be under control, showed signs of resurgence. Interest rates remained high. Student loan repayments resumed. Housing markets tightened and discontent simmered. At a time when national unity was most needed, ideological fragmentation deepened. Every protest, every violent act, every governmental failure was interpreted by some as a crack in the foundation, one that could widen at any moment into collapse. What made this period distinct was not merely the presence of these crises, but the way they were received. The prophecy had introduced a narrative, and narratives shape interpretation. In psychology, this is known as confirmation bias, the tendency to see what one expects. But in sociology, it is something more: narrative framing, the act of interpreting disparate facts as a single story. The story, in this case, was one of reckoning. Analysts, for their part, began to notice the cultural shift. In intelligence communities and policy think tanks, behavioral data reflected a population increasingly drawn to alternative frameworks of meaning. Not just religious prophecy, but geopolitical fatalism, prepper culture, and civilizational pessimism. At the intersection of all these, stood the idea that 2025 was not just another year, but a turning point. International news agencies began reporting a surge in military spending across multiple continents. Nations that once relied on diplomatic posturing quietly rearmed. South Korea approved record defense budgets. Japan revised its pacifist posture. NATO launched new readiness exercises. Even neutral countries like Sweden and Finland accelerated integration into Western defense protocols. None of this, in isolation, suggested immediate war, but together, they painted a portrait of a world in preparation. The United Nations issued statements of concern. Economists warned of stagflation. Humanitarian organizations called attention to refugee displacement and energy insecurity. But among the general public, attention was fractured. In some quarters, distraction prevailed. In others, denial. And in a growing minority, the belief that prophecy was not merely metaphor, but diagnosis. It wasn't just that the world seemed to be moving toward war, it was that many now expected it. And with expectation came behavior. Gun and ammunition sales in the U.S. spiked during the first quarter. Private security firms reported increased interest from wealthy clients seeking long-term contingency planning. Homesteading and off-grid living saw a cultural revival, no longer limited to fringe groups but appearing in suburban communities, upper-middle-class enclaves, and even among tech entrepreneurs. Emergency preparedness courses saw record attendance. Sales of long shelf-life food, solar batteries, and personal water filtration systems climbed. In public, these patterns were not easily visible, but the data was there, hidden in shipping orders, YouTube algorithms, and county zoning applications. None of this behavior confirmed the prophecy, but it underscored its influence. Media coverage remained largely fragmented. Mainstream outlets avoided framing global tensions through religious language, but alternative media, podcasts, Substack newsletters, and independent video journalism gave the prophecy space to breathe. Some treated it seriously, others mocked it, only to draw larger audiences. But either way, it spread. The prophecy was no longer simply something one believed in. It had become something people reacted to. And then the rhetoric changed. What had been warnings about future events began to sound like countdowns. Headlines moved from speculation to inevitability. Analysts debated not whether a war would occur, but when. Military officials issued ambiguous statements about readiness and deterrence. Defense contractors reported quarterly earnings with record profits, citing global demand. The language of escalation, once buried in classified briefings, began appearing in morning newsletters. And in the homes of those who had been watching, this was interpreted as the fulfillment of what had been spoken months before. In this climate, belief began to harden into worldview. The idea that war was coming no longer needed spiritual justification. It had become for many a rational conclusion. Yet the prophecy had arrived before the conclusion. It had named the mood before the mood became widespread. And that timing gave it power. Sociologically, such patterns are not new. During times of uncertainty, populations often turn to frameworks that offer coherence. Prophecy provides more than prediction. It provides orientation. It tells people where they are, what time it is, and what it means. In the absence of institutional trust, prophecy fills a vacuum. But unlike traditional news or analysis, prophecy is not designed to change with facts. It is fixed. It does not update. It holds its shape even as the world changes around it. This rigidity is both its risk and its strength. For those who accepted it, no evidence was needed beyond the feeling that the world was unraveling. For those who rejected it, no evidence would suffice to prove otherwise. And in between, a silent majority watched, unsure what to believe, but increasingly aware that the center was not holding. What emerged during this time was not a single response, but a spectrum. On one end were the preppers, those who had turned prophecy into practice. On the other end were the skeptics, who saw the entire narrative as a dangerous distraction. And in the middle were the watchers, those who had not yet acted, but who followed the signs closely, quietly, perhaps even reluctantly. Each new incident, each cyber attack, military deployment, or diplomatic breakdown, was interpreted through this growing lens of inevitability. It became harder to believe that peace was sustainable. Harder still to believe that institutions could prevent the slide. As this perception solidified, the social atmosphere changed. Conversations became coded. Public discourse narrowed. Dissenting views were either dismissed as naive or condemned as defeatist. And all the while, the prophecy hung overhead, not shouted, but present. It was no longer a question of whether people believed in the prophecy. It was a question of how much their behavior, consciously or not, was shaped by the atmosphere it helped create. In cities, murmurs of urban vulnerability grew louder. In rural areas, land values began to climb, not for profit, but for retreat. In state legislatures, emergency powers were reviewed. In private institutions, contingency models were updated. Each movement was small. Together they formed a pattern. And this pattern, in its quiet repetition, echoed what had been spoken. The prophecy had said that America would be shaken. And though the shaking had not yet come with sirens and smoke, it had already begun, in systems, in economies, and in minds. The shape of war was changing, and for many it had already started. As spring turned to summer, the tone of the conversation around prophecy began to shift. What had once been a warning became, in some minds, a settled reality. Not because the conflict had visibly arrived in the streets of America, but because the internal landscape had already changed. Something had cracked open. The idea of inevitable war had seeped into the collective psyche, reshaping how people spoke, prepared, and believed. But while the prophecy had framed war as an external assault, cyber attacks, military escalations, and foreign invasions, what unfolded within was more subtle, more psychological. People began to behave differently. They watched the news with a new edge of suspicion. They interpreted headlines through filters not grounded in politics, but in destiny. They questioned the competence of leadership, the reliability of institutions, and even the intentions behind international alliances. The prophecy had not brought certainty, it had brought interpretation. An interpretation guided perception. But even prophecy does not exist in a vacuum. It lives inside a cultural and historical context. And by the third quarter of the year, that context was shifting again. In global finance, signals of instability became more frequent. Currency markets jittered, trade agreements frayed, economic blocs began renegotiating key terms under the pretense of self-protection. For many, it was just another round of complex diplomacy. But for those steeped in the narrative of the prophecy, it was a further step toward the predicted upheaval. More important than the movements of governments were the movements of people. Public behavior changed in observable ways. Enrollment in online survival courses soared. Insurance firms noted spikes in demand for remote property coverage. A growing number of corporations quietly revised employee policies to allow for long-term remote work, not for convenience, but for continuity in times of instability. Pharmacies reported shortages in certain long-term medications, not due to supply chain failures, but from quiet stockpiling. Data centers in less populated regions reported increased investment, reflecting a desire to decentralize digital infrastructure. For those watching from above, the shape of the nation was bending, not snapping, not crumbling, but bending under invisible pressure. That pressure was not only geopolitical, it was emotional, mental, and spiritual. The belief in a coming war had created a different kind of war, one within people, a war between fear and resolve, between preparation and paralysis, between faith and fatalism. For those who had adopted the prophecy as framework, the waiting became as heavy as any physical threat. They lived suspended between the world they knew and the world they believed was coming. Some became withdrawn, others became hyper-alert. They monitored, tracked, and compared notes with those in online communities. They debated the meaning of new military movements, interpreted symbolic coincidences, analyzed speeches and diplomatic gestures like cryptic messages. What had started as belief had become obsession for some, and for others, it had become a burden. To believe something catastrophic is coming, yet to move through a world that appears unchanged, is a strain few can hold indefinitely. And so they compartmentalized. They worked, they socialized, they bought groceries and made weekend plans. But beneath it all, they waited. Some did more than wait. A quiet movement of faith-based activism emerged. Not activism in the political sense, but in the spiritual. People gathered in small groups not to protest, but to pray, to plan, to encourage each other not to give in to dread, to stay grounded in a message that, while dire, was also redemptive. For it was easy to forget that the prophecy had spoken not only of war, but of restoration, not only of shaking, but of awakening. This dual theme, judgment and hope, was central to how many reconciled the growing sense of collapse. They did not believe the world would end, but they believed it would be transformed. And like any transformation, the process would be violent, sudden, and disorienting. They believed that America would not fall forever, but would fall to its knees. In that fall, they saw the possibility of a turning point, a national humility, a spiritual hunger, a rediscovery of what had been lost. To them, the war was not just about borders or missiles. It was about meaning. It was about what happens when a nation, once powerful and proud, is confronted with its limits. This belief gave them strength, but it did not shield them from fear. Fear remained, quiet, persistent, sometimes justified, sometimes irrational, but always present. It shaped their dreams, their decisions, their relationships. Some spoke less to friends who did not share their views. Others formed new bonds with those who did. Communities realigned not around geography, but around worldview. It was not just a spiritual shift, it was a sociological one. And outside those communities, others were watching too. In think tanks, intelligence agencies, and academic institutions, analysts began to acknowledge the impact of prophetic narratives on public behavior. Reports were written. Terms like narrative contagion and preemptive cultural adaptation appeared in classified memos. The prophecy was not seen as a threat in itself, but as an accelerant, a belief system that, if widespread enough, could become a self-fulfilling reality. For in a world already on edge, the perception of collapse can hasten its arrival. This was not merely theoretical. History had seen this pattern before. When belief in failure becomes normalized, systems lose resilience, investments shrink, trust decays, collaboration weakens, and when war does arrive, whether by miscalculation, sabotage, or opportunism, the groundwork has already been laid by fear. The prophecy, then, was no longer just a religious phenomenon. It was a cultural variable, a force shaping the decisions of individuals, families, and eventually institutions. It had become part of the equation, and yet the full unfolding had not come. The war, as described, remained unmanifested. There were tensions, yes, escalations, yes, but not the great rupture many expected. This created a new tension. For believers, the delay was not a disproof, but a test, a period of mercy, a space to prepare. But the longer the delay extended, the more difficult it became to sustain emotional vigilance. Some grew weary, some drifted, others reinterpreted the prophecy into long-term cycles rather than imminent moments. This is the complexity of apocalyptic expectation. It is difficult to hold forever. For those outside the belief, the non-arrival of catastrophe was evidence of exaggeration. Another missed prediction in a long line of failed timelines. They used it to reinforce their skepticism, to dismiss, to move on. But the deeper impact of the prophecy was not in whether it was right or wrong, but in what it revealed. It revealed a society desperately searching for explanation. It revealed a nation struggling to reconcile its power with its vulnerability. It revealed the emotional cost of uncertainty, and perhaps most importantly, it revealed how thin the line has become between the world we imagine and the one we inherit. By the end of the year, the tension had not resolved. The prophecy lingered, still suspended in the minds of millions. For some it had receded to the background, waiting to be reactivated by new developments. For others it remained central, an ongoing call to awareness, prayer, and personal alignment.
But even if the war did not arrive as described, the impact had already landed. People had changed, expectations had changed, and the invisible fault lines running beneath the surface of the American consciousness had grown deeper. The prophecy had not created those cracks, it had only revealed them, and in doing so, it had reminded a divided, distracted, and disoriented people of a truth older than politics, older than fear, older than war. That belief, whether in peace, in power, or in prophecy, has the power to shape the world, not always through force, but through perception, through readiness, through choice. And in a world poised on the edge of something vast and unknown, that may be the most dangerous force of all.